Welcome to the Fully Mindful, where we explore what it means to live with intention, creativity, authenticity, and connection. I'm your host, Melissa Chareau, mindfulness and breathwork facilitator, neurodivergent lawyer and coach, and fellow human navigating this wild and beautiful ride we call life. On this podcast, we dive deep with interviews featuring inspiring guests, share solo mini episodes packed with guided mindfulness practices to help you center and thrive, and mix things up with tangents and sidebars, where my friend and fellow podcaster Debbie Harrell from the New World Normal joins me for some real, random, and meaningful conversations. So if you're ready to pause, reflect, and expand, you're in the right place. Let's get fully mindful.
It's just such a hard catch-22. And I think like everything with sobriety, it's like you need to change everything and do it all at once. You need to fix,
that's
you
all.
need to get sober and fix your trauma and fix your anxiety and fix your depression and your family and do it all at once. Like just, getting sober, recovering from anything, whether it's trauma, whether it's depression, anxiety, eating disorder, addiction, compulsion, right? It all is, it's all impossible, and yet it's all possible.
Can you even imagine what it would be like to have your first experience of mindfulness be with Thich That Hanh, with your parents, and with something like a week sober? Enter Dr. Christopher Willard, clinical psychologist, author, consultant based at Harvard Medical School, mindfulness practitioner and teacher, traveler, presenter at TEDx events, author of 20 books, including the beloved Alphabreaths and soon to be released on September 27th, Alphabreaths 2, teacher of dozens, if not hundreds of practitioners. Gosh, I could really go on and on and on, as truly Chris is one of the leaders I admire most in the mindfulness movement. And one thing listeners will soon learn is the reason I admire him, and I think you'll agree, is because not only is he incredibly knowledgeable about mindfulness and recovery and being present, but he's also down to earth, approachable, and real. We talk about recovery from alcoholism and addiction, mindfulness's role in that recovery, trauma, teaching, being with others, faith as the natural consequence of showing up, doing the work, and being willing, and seeing the evidence of that work as a basis for faith that whatever is. Faith in ourselves and faith in the process. A really fantastic, real conversation that I very much hope you will not miss. Hey everybody, this is Melissa with the Fully Mindful, and boy, have I got a treat today. I have Dr. Christopher Willard, who is someone I've known now, I guess, for a little over a year, maybe even longer. I first took Dr. Willard's class, part of the class as part of my mindfulness training, and then he has a 10-week-long Growing Up Mindful program, which for listeners who are interested in that, you absolutely should take. It is such an incredible program. And yeah, he's a Harvard psychologist. He is an author. I think he's written something like 18 books. Yes.
Yep.
And has a brand new book coming out here in the next week or so called Alphabreaths 2. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Melissa. It's so great to be here across the country, but it's a pleasure to see you and be reconnected.
Yeah, no, it's super exciting. And I guess I kind of want to just launch into it because I don't have you for too terribly long. So Growing Up Mindful, that's the book that I know you from, but of course you have written a gazillion books. But how did you first get interested in mindfulness?
Yeah, I kind of have like two stories that I share, and I'll share them both with you and your audience as I get kind of more comfortable with the latter one. But the first one is just kind of when I was a kid, I never heard the word mindfulness, but just a lot of experiences like, walking quietly in the woods or looking up at the clouds in the sky. I remember my dad actually telling me, if you pick a cloud and you look at it and you just breathe, you can make it disappear with your mind. And it was like this great magic trick, when I was 7 or 8 years old. Of course, spoiler alert, the cloud's going to disappear, either way. But these kinds of experiences, or just enjoying the silence in the forest. And then the sort of second part of the story is, when I was in college, I was struggling a lot with depression, with anxiety, with substances, alcohol, opiates, and took a couple years off. And really, sometimes I took some time off to find myself, or you could say I took some time to get my shit together.
Yeah.
Or, basically, what happened during that time is I continued to use drugs and have a really hard time. And what ended up happening was I got kicked out of a halfway house, and my parents basically didn't know what to do with me because I was young. I was 20 or something, and they dragged me onto this mindfulness retreat with Thich That Hanh. And that was like my first week of being sober. And it was totally transformative for me. I suddenly felt connected to everybody and more compassionate toward others and more compassionate to myself, and kind of connected with the world in this really different, powerful way. And I don't want to say it kind of like struck me sober, but it really did send me on a very different trajectory and path. And actually went back at that point to treatment and really began my journey into sobriety, and was sober for a year then, and then had a relapse and got sober again. Now it's been over 20 years at this point that I've been sober continuously. And mindfulness was just such a big part of that, like slowing down and seeing the damage I was doing to myself, the damage and pain I was causing to people around me, and even kind of thinking in terms of the ripple effect of the damage I was doing to people far away, places where I was buying drugs, and what I was doing to those neighborhoods by being the guy that came in and bought drugs, people thousands of miles away, who were in parts of the world that are conflict ridden and violent because of the drug trade and stuff. And that sounds really strange, in some ways, that actually is what helped me get sober. But I think about, like, I remember like trying mindful eating and thinking, oh my gosh, this raisin, it came all this way and all these people were involved. And when I sort of applied that actually to thinking about my own consumption of drugs, and it actually really started to shift my perspective on the how interconnected I was with so many people, and not wanting people to be hurt by that, as well as also like, oh my gosh, I need to get sober if I want to live and not hurt the people immediately close to me. So it's a little bit of an untraditional story, both of mindfulness and of sobriety, at least as far as I've encountered other people with their journeys.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised. I mean, I can't even imagine, my first week of sobriety, I could barely remember to brush my teeth. I remember calling my sponsor and like, what am I supposed to do? So I can't imagine being whisked off to, some retreat with my parents and with Thich That Hanh, and, and having to kind of get really real very quick.
Yeah.
But I too found mindfulness in that through sobriety. And that's something that we've connected on before, which is, I too got so lucky. I didn't know, I was living in Marin County, California, and someone's like, you got to check out this Monday night, meditation out, out the valley. And I was like, sure, whatever. Little did I know, I was going to the Monday night meditation with Jack Cornfield, right?
Oh my God. Right. It's like, this guy seems all right.
Yeah, this is all right. Yeah. I guess I could probably do this.
Right.
It's funny how we get to this in this sort of like roundabout way. And I love how you talked about kind of that similar, like the mindful eating exercise, and thinking about your impact on other people, neighborhoods, and the world with your drug use or alcohol use, and how that kind of set your mind a little bit straight. And
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious too, as somebody who, was experiencing mindfulness as a newly sober person, and now someone who's been sober for decades, is, we all think, so many of us think about mindfulness as the quieting our minds, somehow eliminating all thoughts. I mean, that's the addict alcoholic's dream, right? Like,
Totally. Yep.
yes.
I wish.
Yes. And so it seems to me perfectly ironic that the very thing that, many, programs of sobriety, AA is certainly not the only one, many programs and many paths to sobriety and many paths to spirituality actually require us to go within and be with our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions. And isn't that like the perfect irony? Because at least that's what I was trying to escape.
Right, right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think it is this crazy, yeah, I mean, just how, I mean, so much of using for me was how do I shut off my thoughts, right? They're coming back again. I gotta get high again. I gotta get drunk again. I gotta,
Right.
and then discovering mindfulness, which is, I think the fantasy, as you said, it's like, oh, I won't have any of these thoughts. They won't bother me, or, and it's like, oh my gosh, in some ways it's a tidal wave. And really, I had a bit of a pink cloud with this retreat, to be honest, on a number of different levels, and then both mindfulness and sobriety became much more real. Like, oh my gosh, like I've got so much I have to deal, what's that sort of expression, sort of like, you throw everything in the back seat again and again, you suddenly slam on the brakes in sobriety, and it's like it all comes crashing forward. Or, with mindfulness, you slam on the brakes, it all hits you in the back of the head. And there was some of that then really happened in the weeks after that wonderful retreat, where it was like, I try to sit on my cushion and it would just be tears, or it would be rage, or it would be, shame, or it would be all this other stuff, right, that I've been stuffing, for lack of a better word. And same also, with sobriety, this just that it was popping out in all those ways. And yet, kind of the inkling of the promises of what sobriety could offer, the inkling of, I have seen in people on these retreats, and I'd been to meetings before, and then would go get high afterwards or the next day, or, that kind of thing. But I somehow, something changed where like I started to believe that sobriety was possible and that happiness was possible, right? And that some kind of path through mindfulness, could also help me get to this place where things were different in my life. And I feel like to me, that's what we often start with is, we start with this little bit of hope, and somehow the mindfulness had created this little bit of hope. And it came at the right time as I was, really ready to get sober. And over time, what I think when we talk about faith, and I don't know what faith means to me in terms of a higher power, God, I'm still unsettled on what that is 20 years later, but that I have faith that if I keep sitting, I have faith that if I keep showing up, working the steps, going to therapy, doing all these things in my life that are supposed to help me, that now it's faith that things will get better and not just hope that things will get better, because I'm starting to see some progress there. I'm starting to see some glimmers of peace in my practice, or some insights into that I can sit through this pain, I can sit through this urge, and then it comes back again. But I know within myself that I can manage that urge in a different way. Like I think as an addict, it's like, we often joke, like we can only learn by really bad, shitty experiences, part of my language, right? We have to burn ourselves on the stove. And I think also to learn, it's like I can learn sobriety, someone can tell me sobriety is better or whatever, but I have to actually really experience, oh, I can sit through this urge and it will go away. Someone can tell me that, but until I experience it for myself, I'm not going to believe it. And that's to me what in some ways faith is, or I can sit and do this mindfulness practice and I will feel maybe not great as I'm doing it, but I'll be glad that I did it afterwards. I can sit through a meeting and I maybe get bored during the meeting, or someone at the meeting annoys me, but I will feel glad and better that I did it afterwards. Or I can even spend time with other people and I don't always have fun socializing, but it's like medicine and I feel better afterwards, just like I don't like to swallow bad tasting medicine. But all of that, it's like now turned into faith in some way. And I don't know where I'm going with this, but I don't know whether that resonates.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I look at it the same way as this, like I'm a practicing lawyer, and so, that I look at the evidence, right? It's like,
Yeah,
oh,
right.
okay, the evidence is in. So,
Yes.
here I have now seen, like you were saying, that I could sit for 10 minutes
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't die.
Yeah.
And maybe I had
Right.
to start with like a minute, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
my brain, I also have ADHD and probably a host of other issues, I'm a human and my
Right,
brain
right.
likes to work. It really likes to work. And so, I maybe had to start with 1 minute and then, I was like, oh, well, I did that for a minute. Now I can do it for two or maybe three or four or 10.
Hmm.
Or, oh my God, when I wandered into Jack Cornfield's Monday night thing, it was like 40 minutes. Are you freaking kidding me?
Right, right.
What? I didn't
Yeah,
sign
yeah,
up for this. And same thing with sobriety,
yeah.
just kind of, I made it through that meeting and that person was annoying the shit out of me. And, I made it through. And I said the serenity prayer a bunch of times because someone told me to do that. And wow, it worked.
Right.
So just looking at
Yeah,
the evidence, and I love how you kind of describe that as a faith, and it's really a faith that works,
yeah,
right? As
yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's evidence-based.
Yes, exactly.
And so
Like
I just think that's,
objective and subjective
yeah,
evidence of my own experience. Like I gotta, mindfulness they say come and see for yourself. And in 12 step they say, go out there and see for yourself if you're not an addict anymore, right? Or come and see what sobriety feels like and what recovery feels like. And I think
right,
that's, yeah,
right. Yeah,
there's
I
so
love
much
that.
overlap there.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I've been listening to some interviews and reading some books by Dr. I never know if it's Gaber or Gabor
Uh-huh.
Mate,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, who I know you're familiar with. And, and
Hmm.
he talks about trauma, either big T trauma or little t trauma, if you will,
Hmm.
as being, kind of the trigger, I guess, is the way I'm understanding it for addiction, any sort of addictive behaviors. What's your take on that?
I I disagree with him on
Yeah.
that. I mean, I think that, I've had, you know, some big, some small traumas in my life, and I think, but I don't think I've had a whole lot more than a lot of other people, and yet I found myself really struggling with
Yeah.
addiction.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the things I've talked about with people when I debate his work, and I think he's actually a super interesting guy who's got a lot
Mhm.
of really interesting stuff to say. People are like, he worked with these people in Vancouver, and like they all had a complex trauma history, all these homeless addicts. And I also feel like it's sort of a chicken and the egg because I
Mhm.
think, of course, everyone who's homeless on the streets of Vancouver who's an addict has a trauma history because if you're just homeless and you're an addict, then you by definition have a trauma history because living on the streets and the things that so many people put themselves through as addicts, whether it's prostitution or stealing or, engaging in violence or being a victim of violence or being victimized or victimizing others or seeing death and dying and suffering up close, right? That's all trauma. And yet at the same time, tons of people with addiction before they ever started the addiction process, right, did certainly have like a big T and a cap and a lowercase t trauma history. And I think it's a really tricky catch 22. When I first got sober, I really felt like, don't worry too much about your history. An addict is an addict. I really needed that really helped me with sobriety. Like, don't like I go to therapy to make my life more complicated. I go to 12 step to make my life simpler and to have a simple solution. And then I find a balance between both of them. But I really felt like the main thing I need to focus on is how to stay sober one day at a time and then start to unpack where does anxiety play a role? Where does trauma play a role? Where does depression play a role? Where does family history play a role? And I think I also just want to be careful as I say that because that's really true for me.
Mhm.
And that may not be true for other people, but I used to feel like that has to be true for everybody else. And I can not hold that as tightly as I used to as I, become a therapist as well as just sort of like a, guy with an interest in spirituality and a guy with an interest in kind of traditional kind of 12 step oriented recovery. But I also think it's just such a hard catch 22. And I think like everything with sobriety, it's like you need to change everything and do it all at once. You need to
Right.
fix,
That's
you need
all.
to get sober and fix your trauma and fix your anxiety and fix your depression and your family and do it all at once. Like just, getting sober, recovering from anything, whether it's trauma, whether it's depression, anxiety, eating disorder, addiction, compulsion, right? It all is, like it's all impossible and yet it's all possible. Like that's actually what's the
Yeah.
miracle about it. And so I think these days I feel like I understand trauma more deeply in the way it complicates people's recoveries. And I think it's really important that we're understanding the way that trauma and depression and anxiety and so many other co-occurring diagnoses complicate people's recovery. And yet at the same time, it also fundamentally, those things are really impossible without basic sobriety underpinning them.
Mhm.
And so again, we're back in this like, well, do you get sober first, or do you treat the trauma first? Do you treat the, and I don't know. I think to go back to mindfulness, it's like a bit of a koan, right? One of those Zen riddles of like, what is it? And it's actually kind of a both and, not an either or. And I find it very complicated, and I wish I had a more clear. I guess I've got a response. I don't have an answer, I guess is how I
No,
put
and
it.
I mean, it makes sense. And
Um,
I guess, when I've been either reading or listening to Dr. Mate, I like you really appreciate and what he has to say and his work as well and his thinking around this. And yet I see in the rooms so many people who have not had trauma in the same way that I think
right,
he's talking
right,
about, right?
right,
And so, and I wouldn't want those people to be excluded, because there's no
right,
question in my mind and in their
right.
minds, more importantly, that
Yeah,
they need to be there. And
right.
so it's like, yeah, we have to get down to causes and conditions, but
Yes,
we
yes.
also have to move on and be
Right.
sober. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I think it's a both and situation. So I appreciate that take. You ought to write a book about it.
Let's take a quick break.
Hey, everybody, this is Melissa with the Fully Mindful. It's the new year, and I bet you're feeling the need to unlock your full potential and embrace empowerment, or maybe something completely different. Well, I'm excited to offer a new program with one-on-one breathwork and coaching sessions. We'll embark on a truly transformative journey of self-discovery, combining conscious, connected breathwork and embodiment coaching, and more. So contact me, Melissa, at the Fully Mindful, for your transformative session today.
Maybe I will. But I love that. But I actually love how you went back to causes and conditions, because to me that is, it's like anything can happen. But if you look at like a Buddhist understanding of why things happen, there are conditions under which things are more likely to arise, right? And trauma is one of the conditions under which addiction is more likely to arise. But addiction can grow anywhere. But you add trauma in, it starts to put a thumb on the scale, right? You add, some other various conditions. And I mean, actually, and what the research really says, if you look at the kind of deeper research, is it's what they call is biopsychosocial, right? Which is a fancy way of saying some of it's your genetic setup,
Mhm.
right? Some of it's sort of psychological sort of experiences that you've had, right? The way you perceive the world, your childhood experiences, traumas, things like that. Maybe some, you know, um, like you're depressed, you're anxious, But then lastly, it's exposure,
Mm.
right? So it's not an accident that more opiates means more opiate addiction. It's not an accident that when a casino comes to town, gambling rates go up, right? So it's also how close we are to whatever the behavior or the substance is makes a difference too, as well as these other kind of what people sometimes refer to as kindling effects of like trauma as a kindle. It's like it lights one of the matches, or it's the next match in the line after the genetics, right? As well as these other various factors of I live next to a casino and my parents also struggled with addiction, which is both a modeling the behavior and probably a genetic setup. And I got the fake ID when I was in high school and it's accessible. And it's all of these things together. And I think to me what mindfulness and looking at things through that more kind of Buddhist lens does is it's like, yeah, it's actually more complicated than all of it. Than
Yeah.
we want
So
a simple answer and it's complicated. Yeah.
what you're saying is I can blame the fact that I grew up in Marin County, California in the 80s. That's
There
what
you
you're
go.
saying.
Right, but that is right. I mean,
Right.
totally. Like I went to a college where just everyone did a shit ton of drugs, and like
Yeah.
that didn't help.
No, it
Right.
doesn't help. And like you said, it's all the other things mix into this, and they're the kindling that make that fire burn.
Yeah.
So, well, let's talk a little bit more about your work now. You have been, gosh, working. I mean, one of the things that you do is to teach others how to bring mindfulness to kids and teens, and that seem
Mhm.
and much of your work. You have books. The book that's coming out is about for kids, well, and parents too, and teaching different methods of bringing mindfulness. And one of the things that I love about the work that you've done and that you continue to do, it seems to me anyway, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're very much about like mindfulness can be anywhere, anytime. It's
Hmm.
not just like, oh, I have to sit on a cushion, burn incense and chant or whatever somebody's idea of mindfulness might be, right? Like you're teaching kids who maybe can't stop moving because they
Yeah,
have
yeah,
ADHD or they're on the spectrum or something. You teach kids that are very anxious or depressed and kind of tackle this also as like a family thing. Am I right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So
absolutely.
yeah, talk about that work.
And that came out of like, that being 20, 22 years old, getting sober, stumbling into mindfulness and being like, oh my gosh, like how much I wish I'd had some of this when I was younger. Even if I rolled my eyes at it, right? It'd be easier
Right.
to access now. Like if the seeds had been planted, right, then I could reaccess this more readily. And so this interest in how can I start to share this with young people and the way that it then became so powerful and so helpful for me. And and so that's sort of what drove it. And I happened to be working with kids at the time with this interest in mindfulness. And so like how can I make this kind of fun and interesting? But also like how do we do this in the real world? It's like on the retreat, it's easy, even though it's hard, right? It's like, how do I stay mindful in traffic when I'm running late for work and I haven't eaten and these other things, I'm hungry, angry, lonely, and tired, right? It's these other, and so to me, I think what Thich Nhat Hanh's message is that yes, you can sit still and you can breathe and light the incense and do the chant and all of that, or you can just bring that same kind of awareness to eating, to walking, to breathing, to your interactions with other people, to speaking, to listening. And I think that is really powerful and can be a little bit of a cop out. Like, oh, I just do only informal practice. It's like, yeah, I know, but I say that too. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but I also need to like do some time on my cushion too, right?
Right.
It's both and again, right? But I think finding ways to make it accessible is so important, and that there's ways to make it accessible without watering it down, like that. We can think about how do we teach the building blocks of mindfulness. How do I teach, how do I make breathing fun for little kids? It's like, well, breathe like a ninja, be as silent as possible. Imagine that you're walking like a ninja and then you're feeling each footstep and you're not thinking about the past or the future. You're just trying to imagine you're walking over thin ice, and so you can't, you have to walk really delicately. And so like these kinds of playful elements are really fun and they make it accessible, and they also mean that you're focused on every footstep because you don't want to break the ice or you don't want to make a sound because you're sneaking up on someone. Like, so this kind of approach to me, it makes it fun. It takes a little bit of the gravitas out, which is both good and bad, I think. But also, yeah, it starts to kind of plant the seeds and grow the seeds of what to me then hopefully can become a deeper practice where you are sitting for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes, or maybe trying out a retreat, or maybe 40 minutes, because you can do it a lot better or easier with Jack Cornfield, right? Which is also in Marin, right? But that as well as the temptations of Marin, but these kinds of things, I think, to me make it more accessible. And then there's space in there too for gravitas and for seriousness and for self-discipline and all of that. But I think to make it accessible is really important. And I think culturally, I think what we need to do are find ways, and I think there's a lot of conversations around cultural appropriation, but I think also figuring out, well, we do need to translate. Like, what's
Mhm.
cultural translation, right? As long as we're kind of honoring the origins of these different practices, that's really important. But if we want these practices to stick, they need to interact with what is our culture. Here, what is a culture of recovery? What is a culture of mental health? And also what is just, maybe North American culture or other cultures that we're a part of. So thinking about it in all these complicated ways, it does require some adaptation. And I think that's not a watering down, that's a translation. Although there also can be watering down too. But maybe avoid that by trying to translate. I hope I'm making sense with
Yeah,
some
no,
of
I think that makes sense. I mean, I think a lot of people are familiar with John Kabat-Zinn's work and, the MBSR program.
it. Mhm.
And, I've gone through that program and I really got a lot out of it, but I did have that weird, I don't know, that little bit of discomfort. Like, are we taking out the thing that makes it the thing, like
Mhm.
by not
Mhm.
really talking about the origins of where this
Yeah,
is coming from. And
right.
because we're afraid, I guess, that we're going to scare off some people, or that we look like we're trying to push people into a particular belief system.
Hmm.
And so that is the trick, right? Is like
Yeah,
how do we translate this appropriately while still recognizing the origins from these different cultures so
yeah,
that we understand that, because it's important, I think.
right, right.
And then, for kids, I mean, maybe, I mean, we can talk about it with kids, and I love your Alphabreaths and the different ways that you teach younger kids. But even like, selfishly, I've got a 14-year-old. So, and trying, oh my gosh, the rolling of the eyes,
Yeah.
mom. But, I think even in the big sigh, there's mindfulness there, right? She's in the moment. She's maybe annoyed, 100% aware of her annoyance, and breathing. So
Yeah,
it's,
right, right, both.
it's a win. But, I think, and all teens are different, but I know that she's more interested now in sort of what, the origins of things might
Yeah,
be.
yeah.
And kind of getting into, well, what does this mean? And she, of course, as a teen, she's very interested in making sure we're not culturally appropriating things.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes.
That's really, it seems really important, and I love that teens are
Hmm.
really focused on that now. So
Yeah.
what do you when you have teens or parents of teens and you're trying to help them kind of bring more mindfulness into their lives, like the struggle's real.
Hmm.
Like,
Totally, totally.
right?
My son is 8 and he's already rolling his eyes sometimes.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's
More to
like,
come, more to come.
right, I'm sure. Yeah. And I think, I mean, I do feel like what I've really seen is that it's so hard for parents to teach this. Like, it's just, especially if we practice, right, it immediately sets up some kind of conflict, like, and so, but what I find as a therapist is it really surprises me how much teens resonate when I'm sitting as a therapist one on one. Hey, do you want to try this little breathing thing that can help with little confidence here and there? Do you want to try the, sometimes I call it mindfulness, sometimes I call it something else. You want to try this grounding technique, this calming technique, this, focusing technique, right? And I think that often really helps. And I find that even some of the most surprising kids are like, oh, hey, can we like do one of those? Like that was really cool. Like that kind of like relaxation, visualization with the ocean thing that we did. Like it often really surprises me in sessions that they respond as well as they do, and then ask for it going forward. Or kids get a little bit of it from their hockey coach or their soccer coach,
Mhm.
and they come in wanting more. But it's so hard when it's from a parent. And it's also, I do a lot of work with educators. It's also hard sometimes coming from the teacher, right? There's other kids
Right.
you want to impress, you're not so sure, like, should I make a joke here? Can I settle in? But that's actually what's really cool is when kids are young, like what I've seen having been doing this work now for 15 years or so, is it's like, oh, like now they do a little funny breathing in preschool and a little bit, more sensory stuff and movement stuff in elementary. And then, maybe they're doing something else in middle school. And then by the time they get to high school, it's just kind of normal to
Hmm.
be taking a few minutes of time to breathe or to notice their senses or to do a visualization. And it's not like having to say, oh, we're going to start doing this weird thing now that all the 10th graders are going to do. It's just like, oh, yeah, we've been doing this for a while. Just
Right.
like if a kid had never done math before and you're suddenly like, hey, 15-year-old, we're going to do math. They're going to be like, what the fuck? Like,
Right.
no, like
Yeah.
that sounds terrible. So the more we start it early, the more kids are in a sense just acculturated to it. That being said, we do also want to start with kids who haven't had exposure to it. And I think then finding the ways, whether it's like, okay, let's look at, some of your, I mean, one of the things that's fun is one of the apps is doing like having professional athletes guide the meditations, like having like pop stars guide the meditations. Like for younger kids, they're having like Peppa Pig guide the
Right,
meditations and
right.
Transformers, right? Which is like, okay. But again, it's like, okay, that's someone who's not my mom leading it, or not, corny hippy dippy Dr. Willard leading it. Like, that's actually really cool. That's like LeBron guiding me in this practice. And that makes a substantial difference too, I think, when they see people who they look up to, who have an interest in this, and people having success with it, right? It's paying off in sports, it's paying off in creativity, it's paying off in performance. That's also a bit of a buy-in, and doing movement and listening to music mindfully and these other kinds of things that are more appealing than, yeah, now we're going to sit still and do nothing for 5 minutes, which can, I mean, we all as adults have a hard time with sitting
Yeah.
still for 5 minutes. I
Well, it
still
can be
do
a
20
long
years
time.
later. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's funny, it is true, at least I know in my own life, in my own teens life, that, having this exposure from other people who she admires to
Mhm.
mindfulness, and she may not even recognize it as mindfulness, but it's there and it just becomes a part of her life, or,
Mhm.
in these teens' lives. And that's something that, even though I grew up in Marin, I did not grow up with that. That's not the kind of
Yeah.
mindfulness that Marinites were doing.
Yeah.
They were getting out of their minds. And so it was a little bit different. And so I'm just, I guess I'm really excited to see, what this is going to do for kids. And
Mhm.
sports has been huge,
Yeah.
basketball in
Yeah.
particular, right?
Yeah.
That has been huge for getting kids to be interested in how do I, it's not just visualization, but how do I get grounded so I'm really present and I can really, like be here in this moment. And then it ends up having all these tremendous effects, everywhere else.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know we don't have much time left, but I love the science. I kind of geek out on the science of mindfulness. And I think one of the things that you talk about is like, I mean, those poor college kids, it's always college kids who are getting tested for things.
Right, right.
It's
I
just
think that's a joke. It's like three college kids walk into a lab, like, and they get told to.
lay down in the fMRI and
Right, right.
and think of something. And yeah, but I do love the science, because the truth is the science is there. And I don't know what this, I mean, I obviously, I know that the science is there that shows that mindfulness
Mhm.
works, that it calms, takes the blood flow away from the amygdala, the fight, flight, what do we call it? The fight or
Fight or flight
flight,
response. Yeah,
or
yeah.
freeze or fuck it. It's the four.
Yeah, that's what I like to call it. Yeah.
This is the four F's. So, we know that the practicing mindfulness, not even for very long,
Mhm.
can reduce the flow of blood to the amygdala and bring the flow of blood to, the prefrontal cortex, where we're thinking more clearly and all of that. But have you seen any science around, like, I'm sure there is, long-term practice of mindfulness? I'm thinking about kids who start practicing mindfulness
Yeah.
early and, go through life. Has there been anything on that?
Yeah. I mean, one of the studies was right before the pandemic. I remember reading it, like basically the last time I traveled, kind of hearing a presentation about it, but was with some colleagues of mine at Calmer Choice, a Cape Cod organization, was actually founded to help kids build some skills, to fight the opiate crisis, which was really raging on Cape Cod and continues to. And they did a project where they were actually really looking, and they saw in fMRIs with middle school kids, like longer term deactivation of the amygdala and really quieting it down. So, and so being kids being able to self-regulate a lot more effectively, which is what we really want. And especially after the pandemic,
Yeah.
just seeing so many kids so dysregulated by all that's gone on in these past few years, in addition to all the stuff that had gone on before, the
Right.
pandemic too. And I think that to me is really hopeful, because I think when kids don't know how to regulate, or they are dysregulated for whatever reason, whether it's trauma or whether it's, whatever it might be, or, too much time regulating themselves on phones, which I actually, wonder if there's an association between that setup, in terms of addiction being another kind of Tinder kindling effect
Mhm.
onto, other addictions later in life. But where was I going with this? But when the amygdala is, when the kids have learned how to regulate their amygdala, right, then I think they're less likely to try to self-regulate through drugs and alcohol, and also just to make better choices of, being able to, as folks like us say, play the tape all the way out, right? What is the real consequence of whether it's maybe not so good decision, whether it's drugs and alcohol, or whether it's other kinds of risky behaviors that we know that kids are wired for in some ways in adolescence till their brains develop further. But that makes me feel really optimistic on a number of different levels. So yeah, there is
Yeah.
that study. Gabrielli, I think his name is at MIT, who did that study with Calmer Choice. Yeah.
That's fantastic. And so, I mean, what's so cool is that you're adding to that with the work that you've done with all of the books that you've written and the teaching that you do all around the world. I want to talk the last minute or so about Alphabreaths and Alphabreaths 2, because Alphabreaths 2 comes out on September 27th,
Yeah.
which is really exciting. So for those who, aren't fangirling on you here, what tell people what Alphabreaths and Alphabreaths 2 is.
Yeah, so my friend Daniel Retchoffen in Marin actually, but I met him at a conference. He had all these really kind of sweet. He's a mindfulness educator, therapist also. He had all these kind of sweet, kind of like fun, goofy little practices like superhero breath and princess breath, and I was with my 3-year-old, and we were like reading a book, and I was kind of watching him do some of these like movements in a book about, can you beat your chest like a gorilla and stuff like that. And I was thinking, wait a minute, I'm thinking about Daniel's breaths. I'm thinking about what my kid can imitate. I'm thinking about like being, overrun with alphabet books. Like, let's put this stuff together. I reach out to Daniel. I'm like, all your breaths are really fun. I've been using them in workshops. I've been making up my own just goofy, silly breaths. What about an alphabet book that's like A to Z breath? So it's like A is alligator breath, and B is butterfly breath, and C is cake breath, and D is dolphin breath. So we literally got on the phone for like 25 minutes, like wrote this book, came up with a bunch of, goofy letters of the alphabet, and we had so much fun doing it. Book did really well, and it kind of took off even more during the pandemic when families were like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And there's actually like a little clip of me doing it on CNN, which was I didn't even know till someone texted me that there was a clip of me doing it. And then we were getting emails from all over the world of kids being like, oh, like I invented the excavator breath and I invented the pirate breath. And, we both go into elementary schools reading it, and kids are saying like, what about the hummingbird breath? What about the zebra? So we're like coming up with our own too. And we're like, let's just make Alphabreaths 2. And so we wrote to the publisher. They were immediately like, yep, we're on it. Let's do it. So we were just so psyched that then we were able to do a sequel, and we actually then wrote a like counting breaths, like counting 1 to 10, and like, number 1 is the unicorn breath, and it's just so
Love
we'll
it.
see whether that takes off at some point. But oh my gosh, so much fun doing that and some other writing. So yeah.
Yeah, and people can also check out some of your other work, Growing Up Mindful, which is a really helpful guide to parents and kids, teens, how to bring mindfulness into daily lives. And then how else can people find you if they want to find you and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not really on TikTok, but I'm on Instagram at Dr. Chris Willard, Dr. Chris Willard. You can just Google me also on social media. And yeah, and my website's got a bunch of resources. I do a lot of classes. I'm actually trying to think about my next book. It might actually be something around addiction and recovery and mindfulness for young people, because I feel like that's the book I really wish I'd had when I was 22,
Yeah.
with someone taking me through some of that. So that
Yeah,
may
me
be
too.
happening, and some other stuff. Yeah, you got sober young too. I was remembering we connected
I
around that.
did. I did.
It was one
Yeah.
of those.
Well, one last question, just a fun one, not to put you on the spot, but when you were a teenager, if you can think of one of the songs that saved your life. My daughter now talks about how this song is saving her life. Is there a song or like a musician that saved your life when you were a teen?
Oh my gosh. That's a really good one.
Sorry, I just threw that one out there.
Oh, it's such a good one. I'm trying to think of, like, I remember actually in when early recovery, I made this mixtape of all these like songs that were about like one day at a time, or
Oh
like,
yeah.
just a day and what a difference a day makes, and all
Oh my
these
gosh,
like
I
one
love
day at
it.
a time, like this mixtape. I gotta like see if I can like find the play and make it into a playlist and send it to you.
Oh my gosh, please
But
do.
like it was all like, Sunday morning, by the Velvet Underground, which is not exactly the most sober music, but like, just oh yeah, it was like the day at a
Love it.
time mix, which I will try to like recreate and totally send to
Oh
you.
my gosh,
You can
please
send it to your
do.
followers, because yeah.
Yeah, my I think the song that saved my life, or one of them, was Heroes by David Bowie, to be completely
Uh-huh.
cliche, but
Totally.
that's
Totally.
that's where
Yeah.
I was at, and now my daughter wears Ziggy Stardust t-shirts. So,
It's crazy that they're like into that music. Oh my
it's
gosh.
amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Well, I want to thank you so much. I know you've got to hop off and go do the rest of your amazing life, and I really appreciate you taking the time here to talk with
Oh,
me
it's so
today, and
fun.
super fun. And I hope I can have you on again because that was really fun.
Please. Yeah, I've got more. I've got my next book. I'll just give a little teaser, but my next book for kids, I don't think I've shared it with you, but we just signed a contract for it. It's going to become a new AA slogan, or recovery slogan, but I'll share it with you later, but I'm very excited about
Oh,
it.
I can't wait. Yes, please do share. Awesome. Well,
Awesome.
thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Melissa.
We'll
Great to
talk
see you.
soon.
Awesome. Great.
Wow, 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 right? Were you expecting that? That this amazing Harvard psychologist and teacher would be so incredibly candid and real, while also incredibly knowledgeable and such an extraordinary teacher in just a little over 45 minutes? Do you see what I mean when I was introducing him? You'll very much want to check out his books and talks and trainings, and I will make sure to link them all in the show notes. And I'd love to hear what resonated most for you in this conversation. This is one of my favorites, so please do email me at info@thefullymindful.com. And if you liked this conversation, please do like it, rate it, share it, and if you want more, subscribe, and find all of the episodes at thefullymindful.com. Thank you, and until next time, be well. Hey everybody, it's Melissa, and I'm wondering if you all can relate. Have you ever caught yourself procrastinating, or maybe doubting your abilities, or maybe you have a black belt inner critic like I do or have had, that wants to sabotage your every move with judgment and perfectionism expectations? It might keep you stuck, it might keep you anxious and away from your full potential. The Positive Intelligence Program, PQ, is a powerful 6-week journey designed to help you quiet those saboteurs, embrace positivity, and find flow in your life. Through daily practices and weekly focuses, we'll work together to build your mental fitness. The PQ app will guide you every step of the way and support you, and you'll be supported either by myself in a one-on-one or in a small group of like-minded individuals where you can share insights and progress. So reach out, contact me at info@thefullymindful.com to find out how we can work together one-on-one or in a small group today.